Friends, good evening. Good evening and welcome to New York Avenue Presbyterian Church and to tonight's McClendon Scholar event. I'm Reverend Sarah Johnson. I'm the senior pastor here at New York Avenue, and it's my privilege to welcome you to the church, whether you are joining us tonight here in person in the Radcliffe Room or whether you are one of the many folks who are joining us on our webinar format, whether you're in the DMV or around the country or even around the world. We're so glad to have you with us and glad to be together tonight for tonight's event. Whether you are here for the first time or whether you have been here before or you are here many times, many days of the week or each week on Sunday, New York Avenue is a community of faith that endeavors to be a radically welcoming community in the heart of our nation's capital. We long to engage in God's transformative work of challenging the powerful, of standing with the oppressed, lifting up the brokenhearted, and making God's love and justice visible and welcoming to all, which is a way of saying we aren't very interested in labels. We aren't very interested in the label that you bring into the building. We're interested in who you really are, because we believe that God is interested in who you really are. In addition to the many ministry programs that we have, like this one, I would not be a good pastor if I did not extend an invitation for you to join us on Sunday mornings. We gather for worship every Sunday at 10 a.m. in the sanctuary or also online. And so if you are looking for a spiritual home or if you find yourself in the DC area, as folks often do for work or for life, we invite you to join us each Sunday at 10 a.m. Tonight's program, for many of you who have attended McClendon Scholar events before, may know that this is part of the legacy of a former associate pastor here at New York Avenue, the late Reverend Dr. Jack McClendon. Jack's vision was for this program to help enable the church to continue to have a conversation with thought leaders and scholars of the day in ways that brought together life and faith and helped the church to be more faithful in its witness and helped us to grow as community, people who believe in the common good and want to work together for it. We are thrilled in that spirit to welcome back a friend to New York Avenue. Tonight we are welcoming EJ Dionne, who has been with us several times before, in fact, most recently in 2020. What a joy to have you back with us, and we look forward to your remarks tonight. As we begin, let me open with a word of prayer. Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we come before you this night with hearts full of gratitude for the gift of gathering. We thank you for the opportunity simply to come together, whether it be here in this room or whether it be through the gift of technology. And we're grateful for the wisdom that you have entrusted to us through scholars and thinkers and leaders. And we are especially thankful for EJ's presence with us tonight. We pray for your guidance as we engage in thoughtful conversation and reflections on some of the issues that shape our world. Open our minds and our hearts to new perspectives. Help us to listen with humility and with hope. And may the spirit of wisdom and truth be among us, guiding our actions and our conversations as we strive to live faithfully in a complex and ever-changing world, but a world that ever and always belongs to you. Amen.
I want to add my welcome on behalf of the McClendon Scholar Program and say how glad we are you're with us here tonight. We've had a very busy year with the McClendon Scholar Program. This is our 10th program of the year, our final one for 2024, and we really appreciate your support and in particular the help of those who sort of help put these programs together. We have a McClendon Scholar Council made up of 10 individuals. A few are here. If you're here, raise your hand on the council. Paul and Rebecca and Adam and Melissa Jane out in the hall. There are 10 people who work with me and others in the church to do these programs, and we really appreciate all your efforts. We have over 900 people registered for this program tonight. And that may be a bit of a surprise to you sitting here in this room in New York Avenue, because we are not anywhere near that number, although this is a good crowd for downtown on a Monday night. So most people are joining us via webinar, and I just want to welcome those who are online, say how glad we are you're tuning in. We always like to hear from those online as to where you're tuning in from. We invite you to take a moment and type your name and where you're from into the chat function. Maybe if you're with a particular congregation, to let us know that also. We've learned that more than half of the people who participate in our online programs are from away from the D.C. area. So we always like to get a check-in and hear who's tuning in and from what far-flung parts of the country. Those of you here in person, hope you had a chance to meet the person near you, and we invite you to linger afterwards and chat some if you want. The garage will be open till 9:30, so you can visit a little afterwards if you want and not have your car locked up for the night. It's now been 18 years since the famous biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann initiated the McClendon Scholar Program back in this month, December of 2006. And we actually were fortunate to have Walter Brueggemann again a few years later in 2017 on the 500th anniversary of the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. What better person to have you with you on that weekend than Walter Brueggemann? And he is representative of the wonderful programs we've had, and I invite you to go online to our website, learn a little bit about some of the programs we've had in the past, as well as information on upcoming programs. You see the address there, nyapc.org/MSIR. You'll see recordings from an amazing array of prominent Americans who have done programs during the last few years, including James Lawson, who sadly just died recently and did a wonderful program with us a few years ago. Kathleen Hayhoe, William Barber, David French, Brian McLaren, Corinna Gore, Raphael Warnock, before he was a senator, was a McClendon scholar. We've had a wonderful variety of people come and join us, and I invite you to learn more about them on that website. During the years, our programs have focused on several general subject areas, and we've tended to focus on those in repeat ways throughout the years. And one of those areas is what I would call Christian citizenship, and that question of what role people of faith should play in the public arena. In particular, we've had several programs over the last few years looking at the toxic political polarization in the country and the deep divisions that still haunt us as we now come to the end of this year. And of course, we know that these deep divisions and this polarization are a large part of the story of the elections that we just finished. Tonight, we want to wrestle with those issues and other questions related to the election that just took place and how we should respond to those election results. As we do, we are, of course, delighted to have EJ Dionne with us to be our guide. After EJ speaks, there will be a time for questions. We hope to have a fair number of questions, and in order to get as many as we can, what we're going to ask you to do is those here who would like to ask a question, to write it out on one of the cards we handed out. If you need a card now, raise your hand, and we can make sure you get one. Hands up, a couple of people wanted cards and didn't get one. Write out a question, and we will get to as many as we can. By writing them out, we can go more quickly and cover many more questions, and people have to come to microphones, etc. If you're online, type your questions into the question period. We have someone here monitoring the online questions who's going to pick a few to ask, and we want to bring in the voices of those folks online if we can at all. So we get to the beginning of the question periods, we'll take a moment, collect questions from in here, and we'll be looking at the ones that you submit online. So it's now my privilege to introduce EJ Dionne. EJ is an internationally recognized journalist, political commentator, and thought leader. He is best known nationally for his syndicated column in the Washington Post, and he's also a senior fellow in the governance studies program at Brookings, and also a professor in the Foundations of Democracy and Culture program at Georgetown University. In addition to his columns, he appears regularly on National Public Radio and MSNBC, and has, of course, been a guest on many other national media outlets. He's also a best-selling author, and we'll give more information later on about some of his books. And he's also the co-editor of several other volumes. It was from one of his early books that I first became familiar with EJ Dionne. In 1991, he published his award-winning book, Why Americans Hate Politics. And at the time, I was an adjunct professor in the University of Southern California program here in Washington, and we were using that book in a seminar that I was teaching on American politics. I was very impressed by the insights of the book and the readability of it. And EJ, you'll be glad to know my students really liked the book a lot. And we used it for several years after that. We found it so insightful. After this introduction to EJ Dionne, I began to read his work regularly in the Post, and along with many others, of course, have come to regard him as one of our country's most knowledgeable and insightful journalists. The fact that EJ Dionne is also a man of faith who brings his ethical and moral concerns to his political analysis makes him, in my eyes, an even more important voice in our national discussions. EJ was raised in Fall River, Massachusetts, attended Harvard, and then studied at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. His journalism career began in 1975 when he worked for the New York Times, first doing state, local, and national, and then later serving as a foreign correspondent. He joined the Post in 1990 as a reporter and has written his regular column since 1993. We first had EJ Dionne as the McClendon Scholar, as Sarah alluded to, in December of 2016, after the shocking results of that election, which produced President Trump. We had him again in December of 2020 for a webinar to discuss the meaning of the Biden victory and what many thought at that time would be the beginning of the post-Trump era. Now here we are again in December of 2024, just 6 weeks before the beginning of the second Trump presidency. EJ offered a great deal of helpful insight the first two times he was with us, and I can't think of anyone we'd rather have to help us sort through the election results and better understand the country than EJ Dionne. Welcome again, EJ, to the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. We're glad to have you a third time as a McClendon Scholar.
I really wish I could say the third time is the charm, and I was bringing really good news tonight. I just want to thank Theo, who, if I may follow your pastor, is radically generous and radically welcoming. And I loved your introduction here, Reverend, and I did feel radically welcomed. And as I listened to you, you made me think of one of my favorite comments on religion. It's from the great Yale scholar of religion, Yaroslav Pelikan, who said that traditionalism is the dead religion of the dead religion of the living, and tradition is the living religion of the dead. And I think your pastor represents tradition in all of its best senses, and I am really honored to be here. It's also very disconcerting to know that I am speaking after, the Reverend Barber, the Reverend Warnock. I once had the great good fortune, but also the challenge of speaking on a program with the Reverend Barber, and if you've ever heard him speak, he is really extraordinary. And I got up and I said, I can't tell which is more unfair in this world, to have to speak before the Reverend Barber or to have to speak after the Reverend Barber. But it was a great honor, and I just didn't pretend that I could top him. I want to say welcome also all the people online. Bless you for being there. And I know we're going to have a Q&A, and I want to say that I always welcome dissent. I think dissent and disagreement is a good thing. So if you think I'm really, really wrong on something, please say so, and we can have a dialogue on that. Maybe even a good argument. You know, argument is a good word. We don't realize that. There's the great historian Christopher Lasch wrote a great essay called The Lost Art of Argument, where he said what we have now is really not real argument. It's just competing statements crossing each other. In real argument, you have to enter imaginatively into the ideas of your opponent, if only at the beginning to try to persuade her or him, but in the process, you put your own ideas at risk. And that you learn from argument. And so Lasch had a great line where he said that argument is at the heart of education, and education should be at the heart of democracy. And therefore, democracy might not be the most efficient form of government, but it ought to be the most educational form of government. We have a lot of educational reform to do, I think, when it comes to our democracy. But in terms of dissent, if you write a column of any point of view, this doesn't just happen to people on the liberal or progressive side. People tend to write you a lot more when they disagree than when they agree. And I actually welcome hate mail. And one of the reasons I do is because we live in a world where increasingly people live in their own opinion world and don't even read or listen to arguments by other people. And so if somebody sends me hate mail, they have at least gone to the trouble of reading something by someone they disagree with so much that they are sending that letter. And one of my favorites, it's one of the most polite pieces of dissenting mail I ever got. It began, "Dear Mr. Dionne, are you as dumb in person?" And so you may get nothing out of my talk tonight, but at least those in the room here will be able to answer that question for yourself. So I'll tell you what I'm proposing to do tonight. First, I'm just going to be, I'm going to start out as a straight-up political analyst and explain what I think happened briefly in this election, why it happened. And I confess, I'm in a church, I should confess. I confess that this did not turn out the way I expected. I actually wrote a whole column about why I thought I got it wrong, because I actually thought by the end that Harris was going to win the election. But I want to go through why I think she didn't. Then I want to talk about two experiences I had, very different experiences. One in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, where your pastor hails from North Carolina, actually. I didn't do it to pander to the pastor, but it's a good thing. The one from Rocky Mount, North Carolina, the other from my hometown of Fall River, Massachusetts. And I'm going to talk about that. I'll talk a bit about what I think needs to be done, speaking as a progressive who is worried about what might happen under a Trump presidency. But then I want to warn you that I'm going to go quite religious on you at the end. I was thinking of what I wanted to talk about tonight, and I have a particular view of Christmas, and we are in that season where I think Christmas is actually a more informative holiday to what we need to do than we might think. So that's where I'm going to take you tonight. Just to begin, I think that there are a couple of things that can be said. First, I think when you look at the polling, we could go on about the replacement of President Biden on the ticket and his decision to drop out. But when you look at where the polls were before and where the polls were afterward, and looked at the trajectory of the election, I think the answer is that Harris, in the end, improved the Democrats' chances. Indeed, I think she really dominated the first 8 weeks of the campaign, not only with her original introduction to the American people, but a very successful Democratic convention and extremely successful debate with Mr. Trump. And then I think the trajectory of the campaign changed And you can start seeing that in the squiggly lines of the polling. And I'm afraid that the trajectory of the campaign may have changed on that week when the charges, completely false statements were circulated by Mr. Trump and Mr. Vance about immigrants eating dogs and cats, dogs, I guess, in Springfield, Ohio, which was completely untrue. The immigrants, mostly Haitian immigrants who were there legally, but I think it was the moment when the Trump side grabbed control of the campaign, and I think they never fully relinquished it. There were three big problems that Harris or Biden himself would have faced that helped elect Donald Trump. These are all numbers from the exit polls, so people who actually voted that day. If you ask the people who voted that day what they thought of Biden, 59% disapproved of President Biden. That's a very heavy burden for an incumbent party to carry. If you asked people their opinion on the direction of the country, 73% said they were dissatisfied or angry. Only 25% said they were enthusiastic or satisfied. And thirdly, people despite the performance of the economy, which was so good on paper and in reality and in one way, that the Economist magazine called our economy the envy of the world, but that is not how it felt to people. Again, the people who voted on Election Day, 68% said the economy was not so good or poor. 31% said it was excellent or good. I had a Republican and Democratic pollster come to my class at Georgetown, and I told the Republican, he's not a Trump Republican, but he is a good pollster, and he put up a slide for my students that I think in many ways it was three sets of numbers that really explained what happened. The first was a comparison of the inflation rate under Trump and Biden. Average inflation rate, 1% under Trump, 5% under Biden. Of course, there was that spike in 2022. The second number was interest rates, 3% under Trump, 6% under Biden. The third was the cost of a market basket of food, $100 under Trump, $125 under Biden. And the day after the election, I called my friend Whit and I said, your slide was right. That was, I think, decisive. And you saw this when voters were asked, why did you vote the way you did? The exit poll gave people 5 choices, and they picked one to describe the most important issue to them. 32% picked the economy. Trump carried those voters by 63%. 12% picked immigration. Those voters voted for Trump by a margin of 80%. On the other side, 14% picked abortion. They voted for Harris, plus 52. And the state of democracy, they voted for Harris, plus 62. Almost no one picked foreign policy as 4% picked foreign policy as the most important issue to them. I think one of the interesting things is to compare the key social issue for Harris, which was abortion, and Trump's key social issue, which is immigration. Harris carried the voters who voted basically on reproductive rights by 52%, but note that Trump carried the other group, the immigration group, by 80%. Now, why did that happen? I think on the one hand, support for reproductive rights has increased since the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision. Again, the exit poll found that 65% of voters said abortion should be legal all or most of the time. Only 31% said it should be all or mostly illegal. Harris carried the legal, mostly legal group by 40 points. Trump carried the illegal, mostly illegal group by 83 points. I think a couple of things happened with the abortion issue. Democrats had counted on it to really push them forward. One is there is a residual movement, as that poll showed. 31% still oppose abortion. Some of the people who voted on that issue actually were voting what they would see as the pro-life position, opposed to reproductive rights. But also a lot of voters felt that they could protect abortion rights in other ways and voted on other questions. There's polling that suggests that people who were angry about the economy and supportive of abortion rights still ended up voting for Trump. And indeed, on Election Day, voters in 7 states passed referenda to enshrine abortion rights in state law and their state constitutions. In Florida, 57% voted for a referendum on abortion rights, but the legislature changed the threshold to passage for 60%. It failed in only 2 states. But there were states like Arizona where abortion rights won and Trump won. And I think that split tells us something about what happened with that issue. I could give you a whole analysis of state-by-state swings, which are very interesting, but I won't go through that. I won't go through that in much detail, except to say a couple of things. That the 3 states where where the swing to Harris was least was in Georgia, in North Carolina, and Wisconsin. I think that what that tells us for the future is that Georgia and North Carolina are probably destined to be 2 of the key swing states permanently. And North Carolina and Wisconsin had 2 of the best organized parties, Democratic parties in the country. And I think both of them show organizing actually works. And I'm going to get there again later. One warning sign for Democrats in this election is how much ground they lost in very strongly Democratic states. One of the biggest swings in the country was in New York, that swung 11 points to Trump. New Jersey swung 10 points to Trump. Massachusetts swung 8 points to Trump. Now, some of that, I think, was a low turnout among Democrats in states where there really wasn't a campaign and there wasn't an incentive to vote. But I also think you're seeing some frustration in cities with crime, with homelessness. I think that gives Democrats something to think about. But one thing did not happen in this election, and I think it's very, very important, particularly for those of us who are critical of President-elect Trump and are very worried about what he's going to do. This was not a mandate except to lower prices and do something about immigration, and it was not a landslide in any way, shape, or form. Trump's margin will be lower than Hillary Clinton's popular vote margin was in 2016, now that all the votes have been counted. And here is a fact to bear in mind. Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin were the states that decided the Electoral College. Trump's cumulative margin in all those states put together was 230,000 votes. So 230,900, so 231,000 votes. So 231,000 out of 152 million cast, or 16 million cast in those states, is what determined this election. So our country is still deeply divided. It is still closely divided, which means there is a lot to be done. Just one other fact that I want to put on the table for you. We could go into, I'm happy to go into more detail. I happen to like numbers. If you look at a map of the United States by county, it really shows quite radical change. In 1996, Bill Clinton got 49.2% of the vote, and he carried 1,524 out of the country's 3,143 counties. So Clinton carried about half the counties in the United States. And if you look at the map of 1992, there's a lot of blue in it. There's a lot of blue in the Midwest. There's even some blue in the across the South. In this election, Harris got 48.4% of the vote, popular vote, last count, so less than 1% less than Clinton. She carried 382 counties out of 3,143. And that's part of a trend that Biden carried only about 400 or so, and the same with Hillary Clinton. Those Harris counties, 382 out of 3,150, basically, represented 60% of the GDP in the United States. That's because the Democratic vote is now concentrated in big metropolitan areas. And again, you see that on the map. And this means that states are also, we talk about red and blue states, but states are deeply divided. If you look at California, coastal California is blue, but the interior is red. If you look at Illinois, the Chicago area and a couple other towns are blue, but the rest of the state, downstate, is red. Similarly in New York, upstate is red, downstate is blue. So I think as something that else beyond Trump that the country has to think about is the concentration of economic opportunity in many of the big metro areas, and the real slippage of support for progressivism, progressive candidates in small town and rural America. I want to just talk about my two of my experiences to illustrate what I think out of this election. We've talked a lot as people, particularly within the churches, but also outside, have talked a lot about Christian nationalism and does Christianity exist on the right? Is Christianity a fundamentally conservative religion? And you would get that impression from listening to some of our fellow, I am a Christian, some of our fellow Christians, and indeed, Trump did extremely well among white Christians in the country. He carried white evangelicals with about 81%, carried white Catholics, my tradition, about 61%, which was an increase over the last time. But I always say, if people say Christianity is a right-wing religion, well, they have never been to a church like this, but they've never set foot inside a black church, the tradition of black Christianity. And if you go into, you can, there are telltales, as you all know, about what you hear when you walk into a church. In a black church, you're going to hear a whole lot more about Exodus than you will in a conservative white church, and liberation and the role of deliverance. You'll probably hear a lot more about the Beatitudes in a black church or a progressive church. You'll probably hear many more conversion narratives in a conservative church, individual conversion narratives. You'll probably also hear quite a bit about Leviticus and some of the rules laid out in Leviticus. We share a tradition, and we should come together more than we do, and I'll have something to say on that at the end. But it's a mistake to sort of talk about Christianity living entirely on one side of the spectrum or the other. And I went to Rocky Mountain. I talked to a gentleman called Bishop Haywood Parker, who is the senior pastor at the Truth Tabernacle Ministries. And he's got a lovely church down there. And he was very upset about the way Christianity was being used on behalf of Donald Trump. I quoted him in my column. There were white evangelicals who will utilize the gospel and twist it in a way that works to their advantage and gives them a way to support Trump. But there are lots of us who don't feel that way. When I'm told that if I support Kamala Harris, that somehow I'm anti-church, anti-biblical, that really bothers me. And I think there is this struggle going on. Another pastor I talked to of the St. Joseph AME Church in Durham, Jay Augustine, said that North Carolina is going to be ground zero for a faith war. He said he was not talking about a battle among religions, but he was talking about this deep divide among Christians themselves. And indeed, the aforementioned Reverend Barber organized his Moral Mondays movement in North Carolina, which mobilized people of all faiths, and including people who did not profess a religious faith, in the name of biblical values. And I think that we have to come to terms with what this polarization means. I think that within all our faiths, but particularly within the Christian church, I think we need a really big conversation about where does our tradition stand now toward democracy? Where does it stand toward equality? What does it mean that all of us are equal and are endowed with equal dignity in the eyes of God? And I think I would like to see a lot more dialogue among us, people who disagree radically. I'm really quite radically, I'm sorry to pick up your word again, but quite radically about what the gospel implies. But I also think it's important to know that the Christian tradition has really moved substantially over the last couple of hundred years toward an embrace of democracy, as a system toward an embrace of equal rights, and that we need to stand up for that. I was part of a group with the Reverend Jim Wallace. We put out a statement on democracy in the name, arguing with our fellow Christians that we need to stand up for it. We still do right now. But I think it's very important for those of us on the other side of politics from President Trump to figure out, why did this election turn out the way it did, and what, if anything, can we learn from that? Now, many of you have heard the line about the guy who is so liberal that he can't even take his own side in an argument. And I'm not one of those kind of liberals. I believe in taking my own side in an argument. But I think to have an argument effectively, you need to understand, as I said at the beginning, what the people on the other side of the argument are thinking, why they are feeling the way they are. And so Theo mentioned my hometown of Fall River. And I ended up writing a column I never, ever expected to write. My town of Fall River, Massachusetts, voted for a Republican candidate for president this year for the first time in 100 years. The last Republican my town voted for was Calvin Coolidge in 1924. It was a very Catholic, it's a Catholic immigrant town. They didn't switch in the FDR election, as a lot of places did. They switched in the Al Smith election. And that's because Al Smith was the first Catholic candidate for president. He was subject to a lot of anti-Catholic attacks, and there was a lot of solidarity in that community. Massachusetts as a whole had been a faithfully Republican state until 1928. I would use Al Smith to share one of my favorite political jokes with you. This was a joke told by a bishop in Albany at a Democratic dinner, and this was about how fervent Catholic support for Democrats was once upon a time. And it's the story of Mrs. O'Reilly being taken to the polls by her son, and her son is now pretty well off. He calls himself an independent, votes for a lot of Republicans, but he dutifully takes his mother to the polls every year. And she asks her, Mom, how are you going to vote? And she says, straight Democratic, like she always did. And the son looked at her and said, Mom, if Jesus came back to earth and ran as a Republican, you'd vote against him. And Mrs. O'Reilly says, oh, hush, why should he change his party after all these years? And I think one of the big changes in our politics, a lot of people think he has changed his party after all these years. But Fall River was that kind of place, and it was a union place, and it was a New Deal place. It was a working class place. We started out as a cotton town that moved south. We moved to shirts and dresses. Those went offshore. We've been, for the most part, on the wrong side of the economy for 100 years. And what happened is that Trump, this exploded in the two Trump elections. And unlike a lot of places where you had a shift toward Trump in the Hillary Clinton election, but back to Biden in 2020 and then back to Trump, in Fall River, it was a straight line. Joe Biden actually ran behind behind Hillary Clinton in Fall River. It was a straight line downward. And Harris carried the city by less than 1,000 votes, but it was revolutionary. And day after the election, my sister called me and said, can you believe that Fall River voted for Donald Trump? And so I went back there. I went to my favorite diner, which is still there, Al Mack's Diner, justly famous since 1910, the sign underneath says. And I talked to some folks in journalism there, and then I interviewed the mayor, a former mayor, is an old friend of mine. And what really came across was that there was an extraordinary anger in places like that felt that they had been on the wrong side of things for a long time. They didn't like trade deals. Trade was very bad for the workers in a place like I grew up in. And they had not enjoyed the fruits of the economic growth. And in Massachusetts, that inequality really stares you in the face, because Massachusetts is a very rich state. And the area around Boston is very, very well off. And we have the odd situation in Massachusetts where places like the one I grew up in, which was the heart of the Democratic base, is now voting Republican. And a lot of the wealthy suburban towns, which had long been strongholds for Republicans have become Democratic. And and I talked to my friend, the former mayor Ed Lambert, and Ed told me, he said, it's been really hard for me as a lifelong Democrat to see working class support leave the Democratic Party. I asked my dad when I was a kid, what are Democrats? And he said, you were born a Democrat and you'll always be a Democrat because that's the party that represents the working class. And that was what a lot of people in my city thought. And, I asked the mayor, the current mayor, how he would summarize support for Trump. And he supported Harris in the election, and he had one word, and it was anger. It's anger over this economic decline. Again, my friend, the former mayor, said that there was a feeling post-NAFTA that, I'm quoting him, that the Democratic Party abandoned him, and that as better off jobs disappeared, the anger over that loss of opportunity grew. And the interesting thing about the trans issue, as probably you noticed, one of the most repeated Trump ads in the country was around the trans issue. And we can talk about that and what role that played. But I think part of it, or at least what I picked up in Fall River and what I've heard from friends elsewhere, that it may not have been the trans issue as such. It was, for a lot of people, it was that the focus on so-called identity politics was interpreted by people like the people in my hometown as a focus that was not on them. That there, as one person I spoke to said, we're on our backs economically, and this is what they're talking about. And I think the tagline of that Trump ad was as effective as the message. If you remember the tagline, it's he's for they, them, she's for they, them, he's for you. Now, I support trans rights, and I think it's important that we defend people from attack, but I also think it's important that we hear how some of that was perceived, not so much because of the trans issue itself, but because it became a vehicle for people to talk about how they felt ignored, how they felt pushed aside. And so I think one of the striking things post-election that I've run into is that whether you're talking about the center of the Democratic Party or the left wing of the Democratic Party, I think there is a real sense that the party needs to redouble its efforts to win working class voters. And that's not just white working class voters. There was a real hemorrhaging of Latino votes, and even among younger black men, there was some pulling back of the Democratic vote. Now, it's ironic because I think President Biden probably had a stronger emphasis on blue-collar people than any president in a long time, and that if you looked at the structure of economic growth, of income growth in the Biden years, the bottom rose quicker than income in the middle, and the middle rose quicker than the top. A lot of Biden's program was directed at creating blue-collar work through the infrastructure bill, through the CHIPS and Science Act, through the construction of green energy programs, and there's been no more pro-labor president in a long time than Joe Biden. His appointees to the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, have been very pro-labor. Again, this is where I think the inflation got away. A last sort of observation from my friend Ed Lambert. He agreed that the Biden program had been very important and very helpful, but he said it all got lost with high rent, high grocery prices, and housing and interest rates, and that was wiped out. So what do we do? I'm going to divide my closing section into two parts. One is the activism that we need, but also the reflection that we might all make. I do think I do not believe that the fact that we don't instantly have the response to this election as we had 8 years ago. That reflects exhaustion, but I don't think it reflects indifference. I think that that Trump, by carrying the popular vote, really kind of knocked the stuffing out of the opposition. But this exhaustion should not be interpreted as passivity. I think the priorities. I commented in a column recently on the term "loyal opposition," which is an old term in American politics. I think it's very important always to bear in mind that loyalty is not to one person, it's to a constitution and to a country. And I think that notion of what that kind of loyalty means should guide those who want to protect the nation. I think the first job is to minimize the damage to the nation that might happen, to protect constitutional rights wherever they're threatened, and to safeguard the institutions of democratic government. I think Mr. Trump should be exposed whenever those lovely words reform or efficiency are used to disguise the wholesale dismantling of popular and necessary programs, particularly for the least among us. And I think especially, and this may be because I'm sensitive as a Fall River guy, I think that Trump must be held accountable to the working class voters who helped him win. I think one of the best parts of the old resistance, I don't think the word resistance is popular now or is the appropriate one given the election outcome. I think resistance, yes, to particular things that I described, but I think the keywords should be different this time. I think one of the most fruitful products of that resistance was organizing at the local level. And it's amazing what happened in the country. There were my friend and the scholar Theda Skocpol, whom I'll quote in a moment, went all over the country. She had written a book on the Tea Party, and she knew a lot of counties that were solidly Republican. And then she went back and studied the anti-Trump movement. And she said, if you put those two together, you really have one of the most extraordinary mobilizations in American history, if on opposite sides of politics. In a lot of the most Republican places in the country, she found people organizing for the first time after the 2016 victory. And I'll just quote her and a fellow scholar, Lara Putnam. She said, words spread through churches, unions, PTAs, and local good government groups. And dozens of friends and neighbors and coworkers assembled for founding meetings in living rooms and libraries, church basements, local restaurants. These newly mobilized engaged in many specific issues, but they wrote, the common refrain everywhere was protecting American democracy and reclaiming citizen ownership of public life. And don't ever think that work was wasted. First of all, there were the results of the 2018 election, which were important. But remember that the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, was almost repealed, and that it came within 3 votes of, really 1 vote of repeal in the United States Senate. And the effort to repeal Obamacare called forth an incredible mobilization in red states as well as blue states, because as Joni Mitchell has become my favorite political philosopher. You remember what that political philosopher Joni Mitchell said, you don't know what you got till it's gone. And nobody did Obamacare a bigger favor than those who tried to repeal it, because suddenly people started focusing on what they would lose individually, what their community hospitals would lose, what healthcare would look like in their states. And it was saved by those efforts and by John McCain's brave, one of his last votes of his political career. So that basic organizing worked. I think rebuilding is, so I am very much in favor of refocusing on organizing. And I think Democrats as a party should dedicate a lot more effort to organizing, not only in the states where they think they can win, but in the states that they've lost for a while. What happened in Wisconsin, North Carolina, 2 very well-organized states, showed you what's possible. At the local level in North Carolina, Democrats won up and down the ticket, and as I noted, the swing against the Democrats in the presidential race was very, very small. Wisconsin was a tiny margin. They came very close, and they gained a lot of seats in the legislature. I think they should they should start going into other states because, the United States Senate is one of the least democratic institutions in any democracy when you look at the representation structure. Wyoming versus California, 70-to-1 ratio, so you're much more represented if you live in Wyoming than if you live in California or Texas. And of course, in D.C., we're not represented at all, but that's another story. I think that they should go into states like Iowa, Montana, Nebraska, Kansas, all of which have Senate races 2 years from now. So I think organizing is deeply important. One of the things I am hoping that advocacy groups and unions and Democrats in Congress do is form what I have been calling a working families accountability project. And I think that Trump should be challenged for running with the workers and hunting with the billionaires, if I may play on that old expression. And I think he and his allies should be called out for every budget and tax proposal, every regulatory decision, every appointment that breaks faith with those working class Americans who now form a large part of the Republican base. And I think that project should also be a source of new alternative policies on the basics that matter to working class voters: healthcare, childcare, education, housing, prices, and taxes. And I think there should be a very conscious emphasis on that. There will be no shortage of postmortems offering policy and messaging advice to Democrats. Have you noticed, by the way, that most election postmortems are written to show how ingenious the pathologist is? Because almost every postmortem is, this is what I thought before the election. I was right. She should have done this. Nonetheless, some of them are very, very useful, and rethinking after defeat is always wise, but obligations in politics are not suspended until the next election. And I do think the seeds of progress going forward will be planted by those who respond forcefully, creatively, and fearlessly to Mr. Trump's second act. And I think we should be ready to act. I'll be glad to talk about that more. But I want to close by talking about Christmas. I promised a Christmas story, and I said that I wanted to get to have the occasion, being in a house of worship, to do that. We build so many barriers these days, left versus right, secular versus religious, modern versus traditional, that we forget how knowledge, inspiration, and achievement almost always requires sharing and borrowing across our divides. And I think Christmas is a good time to remember that. Yet even this sweet holiday of joy and light has often become an occasion for bashing each other. The phrase Christmas wars, remember, here you will see them again, the Christmas wars that are particularly popular for some reason on Fox News. That ought to be a contradiction in terms. Whatever happened to peace on earth and goodwill toward each other? But we seem to have them every year. Cable ratings are the new Scrooge, I think. So I like Christmas to be a reminder of how much religious and secular people have to teach each other, and how developments across our intellectual and spiritual barricades have helped humanity move forward. The religious claim of Christmas is radical, and I would argue has helped push mankind in more egalitarian and self-confident directions. The Orthodox account holds that God sent his only Son to redeem humanity, that God became man and walked among us. He shared our joys and our sorrows, and he was eventually killed for his efforts. Now, believers should not be offended if non-believers are skeptical of all or parts of that story, but non-believers in turn might ponder how these Christmas affirmations overturned popular understandings of hierarchy. Think of it as the democratization of God. The Almighty is suddenly not up there judging and ruling and doing the other thing gods do, but instead down here, experiencing what it's like to be part of his creation. I've always thought of this as a powerful rebuke to earthly rulers who hold themselves far above their people, have no interest in their daily struggles, and claim special privileges as a right. If God could walk with farm workers and carpenters and fishermen, how can merely human potentates lord it over everybody else? Now, this revolutionary idea emerged within the traditions of prophetic Judaism. Jesus' language often paralleled the words of the prophets, particularly about justice for the left out. And the place of the prophets in the readings for the Advent season leading to Christmas is striking. In the Catholic tradition, there's a text from Isaiah for the third Sunday at Advent that I think is read in many congregations. The Lord has appointed me. He has sent me to bring glad tidings to the poor, to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners. Now, the secularists could see this as an eloquent expression of a universal yearning for deliverance with little bearing on the validity of religious faith. But the secularists should also notice that religion is often animated by precisely by cries of the oppressed, like the one from Isaiah. Now, the case for Christianity's democratizing power needs to be tempered by an acknowledgement that the faith was also used to bolster hierarchical structures. Remember the divine right of kings. And this tension runs right through Christian scripture. I wrote a column on this, which I'm sort of drawing from, and I noticed that Matthew stresses Jesus' noble lineage and the presence of the aristocratic wise men at his birth, whereas Luke's is the story of a Savior born in a manger because there was no room at the inn, and he's visited not by well-born folks, but by shepherds. So yes, you might say that there was a struggle over equality within our tradition right from the start, and we wrestle with it still. But here's where we should be grateful for the fruitfulness of dialogue between secular advocates of freedom and religious thinkers who understood that the arc of their tradition as bending toward the equal dignity of every person. Now, dialogue, as I mentioned at the beginning, has a nice ring that papers over what at times are fierce arguments. But secular liberals pushed religious people to recognize the value of free institutions to faith itself, even as religious people reminded non-believers of the democratic thrust of their own tradition. At the best, the dueling sides operate within what a dear Jesuit friend and thinker, David Hollenbach, calls intellectual solidarity. I love that term, intellectual solidarity. We talk a lot about tolerance, and tolerance is a good thing. Tolerance is way better than intolerance. But intellectual solidarity talks about a real active dialogue among people who are different, among people who disagree. That it's a common, that we give and receive help, as someone else wrote, we give and receive help on the road to truth. It also implies a certain humility, that we all have a lot to learn from each other, and a shared quest for truth, and an acknowledgement that it is a communal project. All right, I get sentimental at Christmas, I acknowledge. I agree that we cannot wish away the deep and fundamental conflicts of this moment, especially after the election, or the need to battle for democratic values. But if we can't ponder a different sort of world and a different way of dealing with each other at this time of year, when will we? So my two Christmas wishes are that we remember how transformative the first Christmas was to understandings of the divine, and we try for at least a day or maybe a week to follow the advice of my historian friend James T. Kloppenberg, that democracy's health depends on our ability, and I quote Jim, to see through one another's eyes, to think with one another's minds, and to treat each other with charity. We might even get used to it. Now, again, I'm not a liberal who doesn't take his own side in the argument. I do think we're going to have to fight and struggle to defend democracy and civil liberties and civil rights, to prevent savage cuts in programs for health care and the neediest among us, to protect the American legal system, to protect the political neutrality of the military. But in doing so, in having those fights, we also have to listen, because
Democracy requires winning over a majority. Democracy requires creating coalitions. Coalitions are hard because coalitions, by their definition, involve different kinds of people coming together for a common purpose. And the good thing about democracy, and here's where I'll close for now, is something captured in a great memoir by Larry O'Brien, mostly known to people as the head of the NBA. I'm a big Boston Celtics fan, I confess to you all. But also the former head of the Democratic National Committee. And he wrote a political memoir called No Final Victories. And that is the good thing about a democracy, because no final victories means that there are no final defeats. And that if we defend our democratic institutions, keep them intact, we have a great chance of persuading our fellow citizens to take another path. And so I'll leave you with one of my favorite Reinhold Niebuhr aphorisms. Any Niebuhr fans? Oh, I love that. Are you a Niebuhr fan, Reverend? Are you, or you may have complicated, a lot of people have complicated, here and there, we should have a Niebuhr conversation. But Niebuhr was a great aphorist, and I always loved this aphorism. It says men, it should be people, but it was a long time ago that he said it. He said, man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible. Man's capacity for injustice makes democracy necessary. And I love that, because our capacity for justice is what makes us long for a system in which all of us rule, together, and in which the richest and poorest person's vote is absolutely equal on election day. Our capacity for injustice, the temptation to authoritarian power, the temptation of one group to lord it over the other and to try to keep that oppression permanent, makes democracy necessary, because we have to vote them out of power. So we have to defend democracy, we have to treasure it, and we have to use it. And bless you all for coming tonight. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, EJ. There's so much there. We've got about 20 or 25 minutes here where we can talk and want to use that time as best we can. If you have a question you would like read, hold your hand up, and an usher will come and get it, and we'll sort through, and we'll try to read as many as we can. And I know EJ will give clear, succinct answers.
I promise. I'll try.
We can,
I might tell a joke or two in the process.
And we'll also try to add in a question or two from online if we can. Let me start just with a question or two, if I could, EJ. You talked a lot about working class voters and mentioned the column you wrote about your own hometown and the experience there. In reading that column not long ago, I was struck by something you said. I want to read it. It said, winning back the working class voters it is lost is not just a strategic necessity, but a moral imperative. A genuine commitment to social justice demands no less. And what caught my attention was that I know that when we think about social justice, I feel like we think about the poor and the needs of the poor. And you're raising them as there's some real social justice issues here with working class folks that we're maybe not paying attention to. Say a little bit more about that.
Right. Well, first of all, a lot of working class folks are poor. I think one of the, most people work if they possibly can. And one of the great Jesse Jackson speeches, for those of you who remember, Jesse was talked about all the people whom we depend on and usually ignore, and his refrain was, they work every day. Yeah. And so the working class encompasses, the working class is actually more proportionally more black and Latino than it is white, just proportionally. But even if a majority of it may be white, but the ratio, class injustice affects those who are also burdened by racial injustice. So I think that in defending the working class, you're talking about people who do everything that they are told they're supposed to do to get ahead, and face challenges in
having health care in taking care of their kids if there's no child care available, who are paid for less than they need or deserve for the work they do. We talked all the time, remember during the pandemic, about essential workers? And there were a whole lot of people who could work at home and a whole lot of other people who had to work outside the home and risk COVID in order to get them the stuff they ordered online. And, not to mention, all the people who were in the public services. We need the healthcare system itself. And so I grew up, like my friend, the former mayor, thinking that the struggle for working people was a struggle for everybody, and it included a fight for equal rights. The slogan of the March on Washington, 1963, the March on Washington, was for jobs and justice. Bless you for remembering that. You might have been a member of the UAW, because the United Auto Workers Union largely funded that march. Walter Reuther did. So that I see this as aligning with this other struggles for justice. But we should not ignore gender or racial injustice, but neither can we ignore class injustice. And I think we have to keep all of them in mind at once.
Yeah, good. That's helpful. Just a general question about, we've heard so much and so many things out there about things that might happen to threaten constitutional rights under Trump. There's so many. What are the biggest problems likely to be? What are you really worried about? The things we ought to be focusing on?
One of the oddest things about Trump is it's hard to know for certain that what he says today, he'll say again tomorrow, and what he says tomorrow will have anything to do with what he does the day after. So I think that's a genuine challenge, and in some ways it's a hope that not all of this stuff is going to happen. But if you take those threats, I think obviously there is the threat of mass deportations, and the implication yesterday that, well, if you're worried about family separation in mixed families where parts of the family have legal status and parts don't, well, you're going to have to deport the whole family. But of course, that is not legal. You can't deport people as illegal immigrants, in quotes, if they're legally here. And I don't know what that's actually going to look like. I think he's going to come under enormous pressure from a lot of communities, including Republican communities, not to go as radically as he says he will. But I think that is a genuine threat. I worry about the mobilization of the military for that effort, and I worry about the politicization of the military. His appointing a political loyalist as head of the FBI is genuinely disconcerting, I think, to everybody. My friend David Ignatius at the Post had a very good column, and it was a really measured column. He wasn't completely trashing Kash Patel, but he suggested why this is a problematic appointment. So that is something I'm afraid of. And then I'm worried in these budget fights about what's going to happen to health care. There's some important, one of Biden's good deeds was to put a lot of money into the Affordable Care Act that made health care a lot more affordable to a lot more people. Those expire. If those all get cut out, a lot of people are going to lose health care. I think food stamps are going to be challenged. So I think there's a whole area of spending on people who need the help that is going to come under threat. So that's, for starters, what I'm worried about. But I suspect everybody in this room has a different particular worry.
There's a question about this whole question of in 2017, people talked about resistance, and you've sort of written and said, well, maybe that doesn't seem to be quite the right response. Say a little bit more about the general response. If it's not resistance, are there types of persuasion? I know you use words like rebuilding and renewing, or things that ought to be a focus. Say a little bit more about the general mindset people who are concerned about this administration ought to have.
Well, I think many people in this room and online can explain it better than I can, because I think there's an individual. I'm assuming most people here did not vote for President Trump, although I'd welcome any Trump supporter who wants to disagree with me on anything. But I think people had the stuffing knocked out of them by the fact that many of us did not expect this election to turn out the way it did. Number one, did not expect that he would make this comeback after being convicted in a court of law and facing all these indictments, that it came as such a shock. And people, a lot of people invested a lot of energy in this campaign, that it was different. The first time, it was a particular kind of shock, partly because Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by almost 3 million. No one expected him to become president. There's a kind of the fact that it happened a second time around, as you alluded to when you talked about this great church kindly inviting me here to talk about the election. I think that there are just people who are a little numb, but I don't think numbness lasts. And you already see people starting to organize. One of the heartening signs is what's happening in state governments around the country. It's funny, Democrats don't always talk about states' rights. They're sure going to be talking about it a lot going forward now. And there are more states with Democratic governors and attorneys general now than there were when he was elected the first time. Last time I checked, and somebody online can correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was 17 states in 2017. It's now 23 states, including a lot of big ones. And so I think there is going to be that kind of pushback wherever it's necessary. You have a lot of people who care about climate change, who are doing a lot of organizing to try to save, first of all, some of Biden's achievements. There are 18 Republicans, 80% of that money from the IRA, from the clean energy stuff, is going into Republican districts. And 18 Republican members of Congress signed a letter saying, please don't cut this stuff. That's a start. And I think a lot of people are trying to figure out how can you save as much progress as you can on climate. So I see a lot of people in different areas. I see people in the civil liberties world getting very ready to stand up. So I think we weren't shocked into sudden action in the same way. The shock had a different kind of effect this time, but I don't think there'll be passivity. I think it'll just take a little more time.
There's several questions that just building on your analysis about what actually happened and some of the factors. One was something I don't think you mentioned directly about how Vice President Harris was unwilling to identify many ways that things that she would change or do differently than President Biden. And did that seem to have an impact to you? And what are the implications of that and her inability to make a distinction there?
Yeah, no, I think, well, first of all, it's very easy for any of us not sitting. I try to take this into account as a journalist, and I try to do this even when it's a candidate I oppose or a politician I oppose. I don't know how many of you have ever read a transcript of your own words, but it can be a very sobering experience. Even if you think you're a good talker, when you read that transcript back, you sort of say to yourself, did I really say it that way? Did I say that? So I have a certain sympathy. Having said that, it was a predictable question, and I think that every one of us has a version of the answer she might have given. In general, I think she might have said something along the lines of, I supported what we did, I'm proud of what we did, but there were problems I'd like to move more quickly on now. Or there had to be a way to maintain loyalty to Biden, which she didn't want to break, and still say, we're going to move forward from here. And I think the whole administration, even before she got in, probably should have been more aggressive on the issue of prices than it was. Again, it's easy to say that in retrospect. They thought this would eventually take care of itself. The problem is, as you all know, when you go into the grocery store and try to buy a can of coffee, the inflation rate going down doesn't mean that the price of coffee went down. It's actually still going up. And I think that was an administration problem, and I didn't see this myself, so I shouldn't fault the administration, but I think the whole Bidenomics campaign failed. I thought it might work at the time, so I was wrong about that, but I think they should have found a better formula to sell what he had actually accomplished. By the time the election came along, and especially by the time Harris got in, it was too late. By the way, just because I mentioned the trans issue from Fall River. I do want to make very clear, I think it's going to be very important to stand up for the rights of trans people going forward. But I also think we who want to advance the rights of everybody need to think about how we can make this case in ways that other people can hear. I mean, it's a simple fact that one of the reasons LGBTQ rights, gay and lesbian rights advance so much is almost everybody after gays and lesbians started coming out in the late 60s and early 70s, almost everybody realized somebody they cared about and loved was either gay or lesbian, and they never knew that. There are just fewer trans people, and fewer people have had experiences with that in the country. And so it's a long task of conversation, persuasion, understanding. But I just don't want I don't want anybody out there to think that I'm saying abandon them to win an election. I think we just need a better way to deal with these issues.
There are a few questions relating to the American public and the lack of involvement, lack of understanding, knowledge, many people not voting. Long-time problems, many of them, but in some ways it seems to be getting worse of people being, we talk about low information voters. One person mentions how your profession is on the decline in local areas and concern about that. Just say a little bit about this challenge, this problem of getting the American public engaged and educated enough to really help us make good decisions.
A couple of things on that. One, I commend to you for those of you who read The Atlantic, there's a really excellent piece on the decline of the influence of the mainstream media as demonstrated in this campaign. Now, that's a long-term process, but I think this campaign really underscored that the impact of the mainstream media is less, the attention to podcasts. I mean, I don't believe this, but to read a lot of accounts, Joe Rogan was more important than the New York Times and the Washington Post put together. Now, I don't think that's true, but I think you saw the power of alternative forms of media out there. And the fact that we don't necessarily share the same information, live in the same information world. I mean, people who are my age remember the day when there were 3 television news broadcasts that everyone watched. Most people read a local newspaper that included the AP or the UPI, and so there was a shared basis of information, and we still had arguments. We still disagreed, but we were disagreeing from a shared base of information. Now, there seems to be a whole marketplace of misinformation, disinformation, half information, and that's really complicated. Somebody told me about a poll, I haven't looked it up, that people who read newspapers actually voted for Harris, and everybody else, the people who don't read newspapers, didn't. Now, I don't like the attention to the so-called uninformed voter, because I don't like the implication that there should be civic literacy tests to vote. We know from our past that when literacy tests were imposed, they were imposed by one group of people to keep rights away from another group of people. And there's a great book by an old teacher of mine, Sam Popkin, called The Reasoning Voter, who argues that most of the time, people who are not huge information consumers use information shortcuts to get to where they probably would if they hadn't, if they had spent all the time in the world watching PBS and reading 16 newspapers. Now, I love Sam to repeat his experiments. I think he's retired now, but I actually got to call him and ask him what he thinks now. In this new information world is more challenging. Last point, I won't go on about it. The death of the local newspaper is a huge problem for our democracy. Margaret Sullivan, the writer, used to work for the Post, has written a great little book on this called Ghosting the News. It's a problem on a whole bunch of levels because those newspapers help build communities. They hold local governments accountable, and they do provide a shared base of information, and we're losing them at a rapid clip, and it's a real problem.
A question from online, a Presbyterian pastor online picked up on your comment about the need for interchurch conversation, and he wants to know, are there promising leaders in this space? What questions do we need to be asking each other? What should we be talking about?
I think at times
some of these conversations could begin with Scripture and what it means. I had the great good fortune of being able to edit a series of books called the Pew Forum Dialogues on Religion and Public Life. And I joked that the series was uncloseting religious people because they were written by people who were well known in the policy world whose conclusions on public policy, yes, were rooted in empirical study, but they were informed by their religious convictions. And so the first one was called Lifting Up the Poor, and it was an argument between Mary Jo Bain, who served as a deputy HHS secretary in the Clinton administration, and Larry Mead, who was a conservative policy intellectual. And no one knew how important Mary Jo's liberal Catholicism was to her view of poverty, or Larry Mead's evangelical conservatism was to his view of poverty. And it was a great dialogue, and I always wanted those to be used in churches for people to have real arguments with each other where they are rooting their beliefs in the same scripture and in some sense in the same tradition, have reached different conclusions. A second one was called Is the Market Moral? And it was a debate between Rebecca Blank, who served in the Obama administration, economist, was president of the University of Wisconsin, and Bill McGurn, who's a conservative columnist for the Wall Street Journal. And they had an argument of what Scripture makes of how the economy works. And I think you could start on basic things. It can also start with working together on a common problem and then having a dialogue, because I also think working together on a common goal can open people up. You don't hate somebody as much as if you're both trying to, clean up a park or coach your kids, or I've had some of the best, warmest political arguments at baseball fields when our kids were playing. So I think there are a lot of ways in which we could try to do this, and I think, as Nixon's slogan said, now more than ever, we really need to do more of that. So I don't know I think there are efforts like this out there, but I don't know of an organized group to answer the good pastor.
Yeah, good to hear your endorsement of it. Time for just a final question. A couple of people probed about this, and also curious to hear you say, just what general advice would you give to, if you will call it, the progressive Christian community as we go into this second Trump administration, in terms of where to pay attention, perhaps how to sustain our energy through this, if there are particular things we ought to be paying attention to as we gird for what looks like a difficult 4 years on some issues we care about?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first and most important thing is don't lose faith or hope. I once wrote the sentence, hope is the virtue on which faith and love depend. And I realized I was picking a fight with St. Paul, who said love was the most important virtue. But I actually am what Barack Obama once said about himself, I'm a hope monger. And I do believe it's important to maintain hope that change can come, and that, as Obama always said, hope isn't like soupy optimism. Hope is it's a virtue for a reason, because you often have to hold on to it in the face of all the evidence that's against you. So, A, don't lose hope. B, I do think that it's different. It presents differently in different parts of the country, but I especially think in smaller towns and rural parts of the country where there isn't as much of a progressive presence, where people don't know that their neighbors are progressives. And that suddenly, if you learn that the folks next door who bake that great cherry pie and bring it over to you actually have progressive political views, you have a different view of progressive. Some pundit from Washington, why would you believe him or her? But that neighbor can have an influence on the way you think. Now, I think what's so troublesome now is that, and I think this is the product of the Trump era, we have so much trouble talking to each other about politics. We tend to yell. I had a very, very dear uncle of mine My dad died when I was 16, and I was really blessed with two second fathers, and one of them was my very conservative uncle. And I loved him, and he took good care of me. But we couldn't agree. We never agreed on politics. And we spent 40 years arguing about politics. And his kids were kind enough to ask me to give the eulogy at his funeral. And I made a point of quoting Richard Nixon in the eulogy. And I said in the church, partly because I liked that particular Nixon quote, but I said I did that because I thought Uncle Ray would come back to life just to tell me I knew you'd be quoting Nixon someday. And I've thought about him a lot in this period. He died some years ago. And I'm not sure we could have those arguments in this period. And I think that, it's one thing, let's all get along, but it's really bad when we can't even argue properly with each other. And so I think we got to sort of figure out how to do that. But I think sort of organizing all the way down, and I think the lesson of the Affordable Care Act is a really good one to study. And I hope people do some work on what happened and how that organizing happened all over the country, particularly in red states. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, this great group that stands up for the poor and does sort of superb empirical work. They had their affiliate in Alaska did an enormous amount of work on the impact of repeal on people in Alaska. Because they knew Lisa Murkowski was going to be a key vote and was open to persuasion on this. And I think there are a lot of things, that's a good kind of micro example of the kinds of things that we're going to have to do going forward.
Thank you so much. Thank you, EJ.
Bless you all. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, and thanks to the folks online, too, who stuck with it. Thank you. I'll hang around for a bit, except I cannot have my car locked up. I need to go teach my class tomorrow.
We won't let that happen. Thank you again, EJ. I have a couple of quick things I want to share about further learning you can do from tonight and some other McClendon Scholar programs, and then we'll close with a word from Sarah. There are a number of things you can do to build on this in terms of learning. One we've already thought about, and many of you already do. I really urge you to be a regular reader of EJ Dionne's columns. That in itself is incredibly valuable. If you're interested in some of his books, go online and look at some of the books from EJ Dionne. We have 4 here that I have selected that I think would be of particular interest with people watching this program. The book I mentioned, Why Americans Hate Politics. Another book called Sold Out, great name, Reclaiming Faith and Politics After the Religious Right. A third one, Our Divided Political Heart. And fourth, Code Red, How Progressives and Moderates Can Unite to Save Our Country. There are other books also, but I urge you to engage with one or more of these as you go forward and continue to learn from EJ. I also want to invite you to our next McClendon Scholar Program, which will be on February 18th. We're going to have a program jointly with Metropolitan AME Church over on M Street here downtown. In fact, the program will be at Metropolitan AME. Professor Tia Miles from Harvard has a new book about Harriet Tubman, the faith of Harriet Tubman, which is quite a fascinating book. And she is going to come and present that night in the historic sanctuary at Metropolitan AME. If you've never been, those of you in the D.C. area, it's worth going just to be in the Metropolitan Sanctuary. This is the building in which Frederick Douglass's funeral took place, to give you some sense of the history of that location. So we really invite you to join us on that day. I also want you to know about some special events at New York Avenue. This is the Christmas season, and we want you to know about some Advent activities. There's a whole range of them on our website. This mentions in particular a sermon series that Reverend Sarah Johnson is preaching. Then we'll have our very popular Christmas pageant on the 22nd. Those of you in the area may want to attend or watch online. And then a Christmas Eve service, which will take place, a candlelight service in our sanctuary at 7 o'clock I invite people to join us in person for those events or online. One final thing is just to pose for you a final question for reflection. I know some of you were taking notes, thinking about what you want to remember, and that's the question I want to pose. I think as we end, what insights you got tonight that you want to carry with you in the future? If you're online, we invite you to type that in, the thoughts that occur to you to the chat, and we'll leave the chat open for a few minutes after we close here in a minute so you can continue to do that. But think about what you saw tonight or understood tonight or that was really helpful to you that you want to remember as you go forward. Thanks again for being here. Those of you online, we appreciate your participation. Again, a copy of this program will be on the church website by the end of the week, and we'll send notification to those who registered about it. I'd like to invite Sarah Johnson to say a closing word.
EJ, thank you for your thoughtful comments and for your wisdom and for your good stories and for your encouragement to hope. I'm thinking of three things as I digest all of your good words to us tonight. One is about Krista Tippett. Many of you might know Krista. Krista is something of a public intellectual. She started a podcast and a series a while ago called Faith Seeking Understanding. It's now become On Being. If you don't know it, I'd encourage it and recommend it to you. But about 10 years ago, Krista had a program around civil discourse and dialogues. And it was civil discourse that started with folks of two opposing ideas. And the opening question is always, what is something of the other person's position that you agree with or can appreciate? And each person on differing sides had to start that way. And so I'm thinking of that. The other thing I'm thinking is that listening is the closest thing that many people experience to love, and what that might offer us in this season. And the third has to do something with your Christmas meditations and reflections. And from the scripture from John 1 of that beautiful poetry, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Coincidentally, we will read that text on Christmas Eve at 4 and at 7. But the Message translation of the Bible has a lovely sentence in that, in which it says, God moved into the neighborhood. I love that. And I find that deeply thoughtful for what it tells us both about who God is, but also what it might tell us about finding the divine spark in our neighbors and in our neighborhood. So we'll take that question up Christmas Eve. So if you don't have a plan, or if you do and want to change it, we're here at 4 and at 7. But I look forward to engaging that and what it might mean that God found a home in our world. So as you go forth from this place, go out with compassion and justice in your hearts. Give voice to the silent, give strength to the weak. Hear one another, see one another, love one another. It's all that easy, and it's all that hard. Friends, go in peace.